You open the book to a single steady line written across the first page. Every morning, before the baker ever touched the oven, the shelves were already filled. You pause, reading it again. The flour sacks remained tied. The mixing bowls were clean. The hearthstones were cool to the touch. And yet the front table held trays of sugared rolls, braided loaves glazed with honey, and delicate pastries folded with apple and almond. They appeared quietly in the dark hours before dawn, arranged with care, as though the night itself had been at work. Outside your cabin window, autumn light thins across copper leaves. The fire beside you settles into a low, amber glow. You turn the page. The baker lived at the edge of a small village, tucked between rolling hills and long fields of harvested grain. Autumn had just settled in fully. Barns were full. The air carried that quiet calm that follows gathering and storing when the earth rests between abundance and frost. His shop stood below a narrow loft where he slept, and each morning he descended the wooden steps, expecting to begin his work. Each morning, the work had already been done. The first time it happened, he stood in the doorway of his own shop and simply looked. 12 small tarts rested near the window, dusted lightly with sugar that caught the morning light. A braid of golden dough lay beside them. Its glaze brushed evenly across every curve. The scent of warm cinnamon and baked apple lingered softly in the room, though the oven stones held only the cool memory of yesterday's fire. He walked slowly along the counter, fingertips brushing the smooth wood. No flour scattered from mixing. No bowls lay soaking in the basin. The hearth showed no trace of fresh ash. Still, the pastries were warm. He tasted one. The crust flaked gently beneath his fingers. The filling carried sweetness, balanced with spice, measured with skill and patience. Whoever shaped it understood dough as deeply as he did. He sold them that morning. Villagers stepped in from the crisp air with scarves wrapped close around their necks. They praised the softness of the rolls and the new depth in the glaze. By early afternoon, every tray was empty. That night, he remained awake. He banked the fire low and set a single lantern upon the table. Outside, the village drifted into its usual hush. Windows darkened one by one. A stray cat curled beside the warm bricks and slept. Leaves brushed softly across the path beyond the door. The baker folded his hands and listened. At first, there was only silence. Then, faintly, a soft drag across wood. He remained still. A flour sack near the counter shifted slightly, its tied top settling with a quiet rustle. A wooden spoon rolled once along the edge of a bowl and tapped gently against its rim. The oven door gave the lightest creak, though no one stood before it. A warmth gathered near the hearthstones, subtle and steady, as though embers had decided to glow without kindling. The scent of cinnamon reached him before he saw anything at all. The cupboard door beneath the counter opened by a careful inch. From the shadow stepped a small figure, no taller than a rolling pin, clothed in garments the color of autumn moss. It moved with quiet confidence, scattering flour across the counter in a measured line. Another followed, then a third, each emerging with practiced ease, lifting tools larger than themselves without strain. They worked in complete harmony. One measured flour precisely, while another cracked eggs into a waiting bowl. Butter softened beneath nimble hands. Sugar poured in steady rhythm. Dough folded and turned, pressed and shaped. Apples were sliced thin and arranged in careful spirals. Honey drizzled in delicate threads across braided loaves. The oven door opened wider, revealing a gentle golden glow. Trays slid inside, and the scent deepened, warm and generous, filling every corner of the shop. The baker remained in shadow. He watched as pastry after pastry took form, each arranged neatly upon the front table. The smallest of the figures stepped back and surveyed the display with quiet satisfaction. Counters were wiped clean. Flour swept from the floor. Bowls returned to their proper place. One by one, the figures slipped again beneath the cupboard and into darkness. The lantern flame flickered softly. The room returned to stillness. The baker drew a slow breath. By morning, the shelves were full. In your cabin, the fire shifts and settles deeper into its glow. Outside, the last light of autumn fades behind the trees. You rest the book open in your lap, aware that the baker's life has quietly changed, because now he knows, and tomorrow night he will wait again. He did not sleep much that night. When dawn softened the edge of the hills and pale light filtered through the shop window, he descended the steps with a steadier pace than before. The trays rested exactly where he had watched them placed. Sugar caught the early sun in delicate crystals. The braided loaves held their shape perfectly, each seam sealed with patient care. He ran his hand lightly along the edge of the table, half expecting the air itself to shift again. The villagers arrived as they always did, scarves wrapped close, boots carrying in the faint scent of fallen leaves. Word of the sweets had already spread beyond the narrow lane. Children pressed their palms to the window glass before the door even opened. By mid-morning, laughter filled the shop. Coins clinked softly upon the counter, and every tray was carried out into the bright autumn day. When the last crumb had been brushed from the wood and the final coin counted, the baker stood alone in the quiet once more. He looked toward the cupboard beneath the counter and felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Not confusion, not alarm, but gratitude. The work had been shared. The warmth had been multiplied. And somewhere in the dark hours between midnight and dawn, kindness had taken form in flour and honey. That evening, as the village prepared for rest, he set a small bowl of cream beside the flour sack and folded a clean linen cloth neatly across the counter. Then he extinguished the lantern and climbed the narrow steps to his loft, knowing the night would bring movement again. That night, the baker did not hide in shadow. He banked the hearth as he always did, leaving just enough warmth to hold the room in gentle comfort. The bowl of cream rested near the flour sack, its surface smooth and still. A folded linen cloth lay beside it, clean and pressed. He moved through the shop slowly before climbing to his loft, pausing once near the cupboard beneath the counter, as though acknowledging an unseen presence. Upstairs, he lay upon his narrow bed, hands resting loosely across his chest. The autumn wind moved softly along the roofline. A loose shutter tapped once and settled. The village drifted into its usual quiet. The baker closed his eyes, though sleep did not claim him fully. He listened instead to the breathing rhythm of the building itself, wood adjusting to cooling air, embers settling in the hearth below. Somewhere past midnight, he felt it again. A subtle stirring in the floorboards beneath him. Not loud, not hurried, simply present. He remained still and let the night unfold. Below, the cupboard door opened once more. Small hands lifted the bowl of cream first this time, pausing as though in consideration. A soft hum moved through the room. A tone carried low and light, like distant music woven through motion. The baker heard the faint scrape of flour being measured and the gentle tap of egg against bowl. He rose quietly and descended the stairs halfway, stopping where shadow met lantern light from the cooling hearth. From there, he watched openly. The small figures worked as they had before, yet tonight their movements held an added liveliness. One tasted the cream with obvious satisfaction. Another bowed its head slightly toward the folded linen cloth before beginning to knead the dough. Their rhythm remained perfectly aligned, hands passing tools back and forth without hesitation. Sugar fell in soft arcs across pastry tops. Apples were sliced thin and layered with careful attention. The oven door opened again without visible touch, revealing that steady golden warmth. This time, the baker noticed how the glow seemed to gather gradually, rather than flare, as though coaxed from the very stone. The scent of rising dough mixed with cinnamon and honey, filling the room with warmth deeper than fire alone could provide. He felt no urge to interrupt. Instead, he stepped fully into the room and placed fresh water beside the basin. The smallest of the figures paused, turning toward him with bright eyes that reflected the oven light. There was no fear there, only recognition. The figure gave a slight nod before returning to its work. The baker smiled and remained nearby, leaning lightly against the counter while they shaped the night's offerings. He began to understand that this was not a mystery to solve, but a rhythm to join. By morning, the table overflowed. Word of the sweets spread further beyond the village lane. Travelers from neighboring farms arrived early, drawn by scent and story. Children carried small parcels wrapped in cloth back to their families. Elderly villagers lingered near the door simply to breathe in the warmth. Coins clinked gently into the baker's wooden box, yet the true reward lay in the quiet glow that settled across faces as they tasted what the night had shaped. As the days passed, the pattern continued. Each evening, the baker prepared the shop with small gestures of welcome. A fresh bowl of cream, a neatly folded cloth, a swept floor free of stray flour. Each night, the cupboard opened and the small figures emerged to bake with careful joy. And each morning, the shelves filled before dawn. Autumn deepened around the village. Leaves shifted from copper to crimson before drifting down in slow spirals across the lane. A faint chill entered the early mornings, frosting window edges lightly before melting away. The baker began rising earlier to light the hearth before the villagers arrived, ensuring the room carried warmth to meet the scent of honeyed pastry. He found himself listening for the soft stirring at night with quiet anticipation. The shop no longer felt solitary. It felt shared. One evening, after a particularly busy day, he placed not only cream, but a small dish of sugared almonds beside the flour sack. When the cupboard opened, the figures paused longer than usual. One lifted an almond carefully and held it up as though examining treasure. Another clapped its small hands in delight before returning to the dough with renewed energy. The pastries that night carried new patterns in their glaze, delicate lines shaped like leaves and spirals. The baker noticed the added care and felt gratitude settle deeply within him. In return, he left a thimble-sized cup of honey the following evening, set neatly upon the counter. So the exchange grew, not as bargain, not as debt, but as shared craft. The baker's movements during the day began to reflect what he had learned from watching. His kneading grew lighter, his shaping more precise. He noticed how dough responded when handled with patience rather than speed. The villagers sensed the change as well, though none spoke of it directly. They simply lingered longer at the counter, smiling at the warmth that seemed to linger in every bite. One afternoon, a child asked how he found such sweetness in simple flour and grain. The baker glanced toward the cupboard and answered softly, "Some work is done in the quiet hours." The child nodded, satisfied, and carried her pastry home. As autumn neared its final weeks, the hills beyond the village turned muted gold. Fields rested beneath pale sky. Smoke from distant chimneys rose straight and calm in the cooling air. The baker stood at his doorway at dusk and watched the sun settle low between the ridges, knowing that the night would bring soft movement once more. Inside the shop, the lantern glowed steadily. The cupboard remained closed, for now, and the bowl of cream waited patiently upon the counter. The final days of autumn arrived quietly. Morning frost began to linger longer along the edges of the lane. The orchard beyond the village stood bare now, branches lifted like delicate lines against pale sky. The baker felt the change in the air as he rose before dawn, drawing his wool coat closer as he descended the wooden steps into the shop. The rhythm of the nights had grown familiar. He no longer waited in shadow, nor did he rise halfway down the stairs. He trusted the stirring beneath the cupboard and the steady glow of the oven that followed. The small figures worked with the same precision as always, though their movements carried a subtle lightness, as though aware that the season was turning. That evening, he placed the bowl of cream upon the counter as usual, but beside it, he added something new, a small length of red ribbon, neatly folded. It had once been tied around a parcel brought by a traveler from a distant village. The baker had saved it for no particular reason, only because its color pleased him. When the cupboard door opened, the smallest of the figures approached the ribbon first. It lifted the fabric carefully, running small fingers along its edge. The others gathered close, examining the bright strand with quiet delight. One fastened it gently around the handle of a wooden spoon. Another tied a tiny bow around the neck of a honey jar before returning to the kneading. That night, the pastries bore small flourishes in red glaze brushed carefully along their tops, subtle and festive against the golden crust. The baker watched openly and felt a warmth settle into him that had little to do with fire. As the first true snow fell beyond the village, dusting rooftops and tracing lines along the stone wall near the shop, the baker prepared the room for the colder days ahead. He stacked extra wood beside the hearth. He lined the window frames to keep drafts from slipping through. He set out not only cream and honey, but also a small dish of dried fruit, knowing the sweetness would be welcome. The cupboard opened. The figures emerged. They worked with the same steady grace, though their garments now carried flecks of flour that clung like soft snowfall. The oven glow seemed warmer against the deepening chill. Cinnamon and clove rose into the air, mingling with the scent of burning wood. In the quiet hours before dawn, as the final tray cooled upon the counter, the smallest of the figures approached the baker directly. It carried something cupped in both hands, a small loaf, shaped differently from the others. Its surface bore a delicate pattern pressed into the dough, tiny leaves and curling vines, woven together in careful design. At its center rested a small twist of red ribbon, tied gently around its base. The figure placed the loaf in the baker's open palm. Then it bowed. The others paused in their work, offering their own small nods before slipping once more beneath the cupboard and into the quiet space beyond. The room settled into stillness. The oven glow softened. Snow continued to fall outside, steady and calm. The baker stood alone in his shop, holding the warm loaf in his hands. He traced the pattern pressed into its surface and felt gratitude settle deep and steady within him. The exchange had never been about coin or credit. It had been about craft shared in silence, warmth carried forward from night into morning. At dawn, the villagers arrived as they always did, brushing snow from their shoulders and stamping boots against the cold. They filled the shop with laughter and conversation, drawn by the familiar scent that welcomed them through the door. The trays sold quickly, and the red glazed flourishes brought quiet smiles to many faces. The baker kept the small loaf for himself. That evening, as snow layered softly across the lane, and the world outside dimmed into winter stillness, he cut a slice and tasted it slowly. The crust held gentle warmth. The crumb was tender and rich. The sweetness carried a note he had not tasted before. Something lighter, almost playful, like the first step of a dance. He set a fresh bowl of cream beside the flour sack. He folded a clean cloth upon the counter. He placed the red ribbon back upon the table, ready to be used again. Upstairs, in the loft, he lay down with steady breath, listening as the wind traced quiet lines along the roof. Below him, in the deep hours of night, the cupboard would open, and the warmth would rise again. In your cabin, the fire has settled into embers that glow softly against the dark. Snow brushes the window in faint, drifting lines. You close the book gently, holding for a moment the image of flour-dusted hands shaping sweetness in the quiet hours before dawn. Outside, autumn has given way to winter. Inside, the warmth remains. In the weeks that followed, the rhythm continued with the same quiet certainty. Snow gathered along the rooftops and softened the edges of the lane, yet the shop windows glowed warmly each morning, golden light spilling gently onto the white ground outside. The villagers began speaking of the baker's shop as a place where winter felt lighter, where the cold seemed to pause at the door before stepping inside. Children pressed their noses to the glass to watch trays being arranged, and elders lingered a little longer near the hearth, hands wrapped around warm bread. The baker moved through his days with steady hands and an open heart, aware that the craft shared in darkness had become something the whole village carried into daylight. And in the deep hours before dawn, when snow fell in soft, patient spirals and the world held its quiet breath, the cupboard beneath the counter would open once more. Small hands would measure flour, shape dough, brush honey across braided crusts. The oven would glow with steady warmth, filling the room with cinnamon and clove, apple and butter. The baker would rest above, trusting the rhythm below, knowing that generosity multiplies when welcomed. And so, through autumn and into winter, through frost and falling snow, the sweetness shaped in the night continued to rise with the morning light.